Hey guys, tonight we slip into a world that feels both eerily quiet and strangely heavy. The Europe that stumbled into dawn after the Black Death. You open your eyes in a village that should be buzzing with life, but instead it greets you with stillness. No children chasing chickens, no merchants calling out over their wares, not even the lazy clatter of a cartwheel bumping over cobblestones, just silence. The air itself feels hesitant, as though even the birds have lost the courage to sing. And you? Well, you probably won't survive this either, but hey, at least you'll get a bedtime story out of it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment with your location and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing where and when you're tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge down the dirt road leading out of the village, your footsteps crunching through loose gravel. The sound echoes more than it should because there's no background chatter to cover it. Once upon a time, this path would have been busy with farmers hauling produce, children running ahead of tired parents, or maybe a drunken neighbour weaving home after a mug too many of ale. Now it's you, the wind, and the faint smell of something damp, like wet thatch left unattended for too long. The Black Death had swept through like a shadow with claws, dragging away neighbours, family, and even the livestock that had no one left to feed them. A mainstream fact you'd know, the plague killed somewhere between a third and half of Europe's population in just a few short years. Imagine half your town vanishing, and not gradually but in waves of fever, buboes, and whispered goodbyes. That's the world you wake into. You pass a cottage with its door ajar, and you can't help but glance inside. The rushes on the floor are stale and scattered, the hearth is cold, and a child's wooden toy lies abandoned by the bed. Nobody tidied up, nobody returned. The house is like a photograph frozen mid-movement, and you almost expect its former owner to step in from the shadows. Of course, they won't. Now here's a quirky little tidbit. In some places, people left bowls of porridge or bread on their doorsteps thinking the dead might still need a snack in the afterlife. You can't help but imagine an awkward ghost wandering by, mumbling, "Thanks for the soggy oats, Karen." Whether anyone believed those spirits actually ate the food, or whether it was just a ritual of comfort, is still up for debate. Historians still argue whether such offerings were meant to appease restless souls or simply soothe the living who couldn't let go. As you walk farther, the landscape itself feels altered. Trees stretch with unchecked confidence, as if delighted no one's around to chop them down. The lanes are littered with weeds, and the fields beyond grow wild, a patchwork of grass reclaiming what once was carefully tilled soil. It's like nature is leaning back in a chair, finally breathing after centuries of human meddling. And yet, despite the eerie beauty of all this emptiness, your stomach twists, because silence is unsettling. Humans crave noise, annoying noise, everyday noise, that faint racket that tells you you're not alone. You find yourself almost wishing for a gossiping neighbour to lean out of a window and mutter something snide about your muddy boots. Instead, the only commentary is the caw of a distant crow. You remember stories whispered in taverns about how some villages simply ceased to exist. Entire hamlets erased, everyone gone, buildings left to sag and rot, maps redrawn to forget them. Scholars debate whether some of these ghost settlements were wiped out entirely by plague, or whether survivors just gave up and wandered elsewhere, abandoning homes that had become too soaked with sorrow. Either way, those places stayed silent long after the rats moved on. You pause by a well at the edge of the road. Its rope dangles limply, bucket missing. In your mind, you picture the last desperate family that gathered here. Did they huddle together, whispering prayers as they lowered the bucket for one last drink? Or was it abandoned in a rush, a hurried flight towards some place, any place, that felt safer? You'll never know, but the imagination fills in the blanks with more weight than any official chronicle ever could. Here's where the reality check sneaks in. You'd think surviving the plague would mean freedom, right? No crowded streets, no back-breaking taxes because half the tax base just croaked. But in reality, it meant living with absence as your closest companion. Every corner turned reminds you of someone missing. Every silent hearth feels like a joke at your expense. Congratulations, you're still here, but what are you surviving for? Still, there's a weird resilience humming under all this emptiness. You notice faint signs of life clinging on, a patch of herbs carefully tended. Dead outside a cottage, smoke trailing faintly from a chimney 2 fields away. Humanity is stubborn. Even after the biggest gut punch in recorded history, people still manage to stir porridge, patch thatched roofs, and worry about whether tomorrow's laundry will ever dry. You keep walking, your eyes adjusting to the softer light of a late afternoon that seems stretched out by the lack of human bustle. The sun dips slower when no one argues about market prices or plays dice in the tavern yard. You feel both heavy and strangely calm, like you're standing at the very edge of an old world and peeking into the possibility of something new. And as night begins to draw its long veil across the empty countryside, you realize this is only the first glimpse of the dawn after plague. The silence isn't an ending, it's a waiting space, a pause in history's song before someone dares to strike the next chord. You wander farther from the first cluster of cottages, your feet carrying you toward the heart of what should be a thriving village. The silence grows heavier the deeper you step inside. Houses line the dirt path like crooked teeth, but their windows gape empty. Doors swing lazily on rusty hinges, creaking in the wind as if they're sighing at the emptiness. You move slowly, half expecting someone to peek out, maybe an old woman sweeping her threshold, but nobody does. The air smells faintly of mildew and stale straw. As you pass one doorway, you notice a wooden bench tipped over, half rotted and softened by rain. It's the kind of detail that tells you this place has been empty for a while, long enough for nature to start eating the furniture, but not long enough for complete ruin. Villages like this became eerie time capsules after the plague. Entire communities vanished so quickly that when survivors from other regions stumbled upon them, they described scenes where loaves of bread still sat on tables, unspoiled grain still filled barrels, and laundry still hung from lines, fluttering quietly to no audience. Here's a mainstream fact to ground this scene. Archaeologists and historians have documented thousands of abandoned medieval villages in Europe, especially in England and Germany. Some were swallowed back into the earth, their outlines only visible today as strange bumps beneath grassy fields. Others lingered in ruins, their stone churches standing stubbornly even as the houses around them fell to dust. You're walking through one of these. But let's sprinkle in something quirkier. People in certain areas believed these abandoned homes were cursed, not simply unlucky. Wandering into them was thought to invite plague back upon you. A few records suggest that travellers marked abandoned doors with chalk symbols, warning others not to enter, which of course is the medieval version of posting a do not disturb sign, except instead of protecting your afternoon nap, it's protecting you from a bacteria-laden flea. Practical in its way. You step into one house despite the imaginary chalk warning. The floor creaks beneath your boots and dust swirls in the air. Inside, the hearth has collapsed, bricks scattered across the dirt floor. A single clay bowl rests on a shelf, tilted as if someone left mid-meal. You feel that quiet shiver of intrusion, like you're trespassing on someone's unfinished story. You sit down on a low stool, testing its wobble, and imagine the last conversation here. Was it a desperate plan to flee to a bigger town, a whispered prayer, or perhaps just silence because everyone was already gone? Historians still argue whether people abandoned villages due to pure death tolls or whether economic shifts played an equal role. Some claim the survivors regrouped in bigger towns where trade routes offered more security, leaving small hamlets to rot. Others argue entire villages were simply extinguished, with no one left to pack up the cows. As you look around at the emptiness, you realize either version explains the same thing: hollow houses, mute walls, and a deep sense of absence. You head back outside. The weeds in the central square reach your knees. In the middle stands a stone well, its rim covered in moss. The bucket lies broken nearby. You lean against the edge and imagine children once splashing water here, women gossiping while filling pitchers, old men sitting on the edge muttering about taxes. Now, just the caw of a crow cuts through the silence. You think briefly that you'd actually welcome one of those gossiping neighbours now, even if all they wanted was to complain about your muddy boots again. A quirky joke comes to mind: at least you'll never have to wait in line for the well now. That's one benefit of population collapse: no queues. Historians may argue about labour shifts, but nobody's debating how empty benches at the tavern meant quicker service, assuming there was still a tavern keeper alive. You stroll toward the crumbling church at the edge of the square. Its wooden doors hang ajar, their iron hinges rusted. Inside, dust covers the pews like a second congregation. Faded paintings of saints stare at you, eyes half peeled by age and weather. You picture the last sermon here, maybe the priest trying to reassure his flock that faith would protect them from plague. Clearly it didn't. Did people leave in despair? Did they lock the church and walk away forever? Nobody wrote it down. As you step back outside, twilight begins to fall. Shadows stretch long across the cobblestones, and the emptiness feels sharper now. The village doesn't just look deserted, it feels abandoned in spirit, as if even memories don't bother to haunt it anymore. You pause at the last house on the lane, leaning against its sagging frame. Your mind drifts toward how these empty villages weren't just losses, they also became opportunities. New settlers sometimes claimed them decades later, reshaping them into something entirely new. Other times, sheep farmer S moved in, turning former peasant homes into barns. In a twisted way, the plague cleared land for others, like nature's harsh reset button. And so, as the night breeze cools your skin, you push on down the road. The empty village behind you is only one ghost in a landscape full of them. Ahead lie more survivors, more chaos, and maybe, just maybe, a flicker of life waiting to return. You trudge farther down the overgrown path, leaving the hushed village behind. The silence lingers, though, like a heavy cloak draped over your shoulders. Hunger begins to gnaw at you, reminding you of a new and constant reality. Food isn't simply bought or harvested anymore, it's scavenged. You spot a leaning barn up ahead, its wooden planks warped and splitting, and you can't help but wonder what treasures or terrors might lie inside. You push the door open with a groan of rusted hinges. Inside, the air is thick with dust and the faint smell of hay. The loft above droops dangerously, but the floor beneath your feet still holds. You move cautiously, your eyes adjusting to the dim light streaming through broken slats. To your relief, you see sacks stacked in the corner, some gnawed open by rodents, but others still intact. Grain spills out like golden sand, a reminder that not every crop was lost to time. You scoop a handful, chew thoughtfully, and immediately regret the chalky taste. It's food, but barely. A mainstream fact anchors this moment. During the years following the Black Death, food shortages and gluts happened side by side. In some places, fields were abandoned and grain rotted in the earth. In others, with fewer mouths to feed, stores overflowed. Survivors often found themselves with access to food that once would have been beyond their reach. Imagine peasants feasting on venison or fish that had once been strictly reserved for the lords. It was like suddenly getting VIP access, not because you won the lottery, but because half the other ticket holders were gone. As you rummage deeper, you stumble across something stranger, a jar sealed with wax hidden behind a stack of hay bales. You pry it open, and inside is a strange mixture: dried herbs, twigs, and what looks suspiciously like crushed beetles. You wrinkle your nose, realizing this was someone's emerger. NC Remedy Stash. Quirky tidbit. Some people believed powdered beetles or even crushed emeralds could ward off plague. Yes, emeralds, the medieval equivalent of, if you're rich enough, maybe your jewelry can cure you. Spoiler, it couldn't. You hold the jar and can't help but smirk. Whoever left this behind probably thought it was their golden ticket to survival. But here you are, centuries later, realizing it was just beetle dust. If there's a moral here, it's that sometimes people will try anything in the face of fear, and that hasn't changed much in modern times. As you tuck the jar back, your mind drifts to what scholars still debate. How many people truly scavenged versus how many tried to maintain their normal routines. Some argue that most survivors desperately clung to farming, tending livestock and keeping order. Others claim that many households abandoned traditional life entirely, wandering as opportunistic foragers. Standing in this barn, you can picture both truths. Maybe one family starved here, unwilling to touch what felt tainted. Another might have feasted like kings, laughing nervously while chewing half-rancid grain. You grab a stale wheel of cheese from a shelf and break off a chunk. It's hard enough to knock out a tooth, but hunger lowers your standards. You chew slowly, grimacing, and mumble to yourself that at least you don't have to tip the waiter. That's the upside to post-apocalyptic dining, 5-star service without the bill. Stepping back outside, you notice the farmyard. Chickens once scratched here, but only feathers remain, strewn across the mud. A cart lies overturned, one wheel cracked. The whole scene feels like someone hit pause on life, walked away, and never returned to press play. You pause, picturing the farmer who owned this land. Did he lock the barn in a rush, fleeing toward some rumor of safety? Did his family stay until the last, collapsing in the cottage nearby? You'll never know, but the emptiness answers louder than any written record could. Night begins to fall, and the hunger in your belly settles with the food you scavenged. You feel a little more alive, but the cost of survival lingers in your mind. Every meal is a gamble now. Is it edible? Is it safe? Is it cursed? You shrug, maybe all three. At least it fills the silence for one more night. As you lie down on a pile of hay outside the barn, the stars blink awake in the darkening sky. You clutch your belly, feeling both thankful and uneasy. Survival, it seems, is less about thriving and more about learning to chew beetle dust remedies with a straight face. You leave the barn behind and drift along a hedgerow that should be neatly clipped, but the hawthorn has turned into a shaggy beast, snagging your sleeves like it wants to keep you. The path narrows to a ribbon. Nettles lean in, whispering against your boots. You brush them back with a stick and step out where the village fields once stretched in careful strips, long, narrow ribbons that used to glow gold in summer and stubble brown after harvest. Now they've gone wild. Rye pokes up where it shouldn't. Dock and thistle and fat-headed burdock take the stage like they've been waiting centuries for humans to miss a cue. You trudge along a ghost of a boundary, a raised ridge that remembers the old open field system, even if most of its farmers have forgotten it permanently. You pause and listen to the low click of grasshoppers. A hare bolts from a clump of couch grass and skitters diagonally, as if embarrassed to have been spotted eating someone's abandoned livelihood. Everywhere you see the afterimage of order, the lines where oxen once pulled heavy ploughs, the curves where scythes cut neat arcs through barley. You imagine the rhythm, thrum of hoof, hiss of blade, the farmer's breath. Now the wind handles all the percussion, and the weeds sing lead vocals. If nature could smirk, these fields are doing it. A mainstream fact settles you into the scene. After the Black Death, large swathes of arable land across Europe were left untended, and in many regions, especially parts of England, landholders shifted from labour-hungry grain to easier, more profitable pasture. Sheep nibble what ploughs no longer turn, and wool money starts to speak louder than wheat prayers. You can practically hear a distant bleat practicing for its role as economic policy. It's funny in a sleepy way. The plague didn't just thin the crowd, it rewrote the script of the countryside. You crouch to touch. The soil, dry at the top, cool and damp underneath. You rub it between your fingers and think about how plough teams once cut deep, letting air in, letting roots tangle properly. Now, the mat of wild growth knits tight, a green blanket tucking the land in for a long nap. You find the iron tip of a broken coulter poking out of the earth, orphaned from a plough that must have snapped and been left, the repairman gone to fever or fear. You turn it in your hand like a relic and lay it back, a quiet offering to the field's new religion. No priests, just seasons. Down by the meadow, a drainage ditch has silted up and widened into a lazy ribbon of water. Dragonflies patrol it like tiny jeweled guards, and reeds crowd the edges until the ditch gives up and becomes a pond. Your reflection warps in the ripples. A tired face, straw clinging to your hair from last night's haybed, and that well-chewed chunk of barn cheese still a memory on your tongue. Fresh running water was once the village's carefully maintained lifeline. Now it decides for itself where to wander. Good for you, you whisper to the ditch. Find yourself and realize you're giving self-help advice to medieval hydrology. Joke 1. You're welcome. Across the meadow, a cluster of apple trees leans toward each other like old friends. The fruit is small and tart this year, branches unpruned, but your mouth waters anyway. You slip an apple into your bag and keep moving, the path braided with bindweed. The air is sweeter here, crushed clover, a hint of wood smoke from somewhere you can't see. Wildflowers speckle the grass, and you think about how beauty insists on showing up even when no one has time to applaud. A quirky tidbit floats up from the back of your mind. Some farmers used to tie a sprig of rowan or hawthorn on the first plough of the season, a tiny charm to ward off blight and bad luck. Others swore by burying a copper coin at the field's corner to keep worms at bay. Is it science? Not really. Is it hope? Absolutely. You picture the little talisman hanging from an ox's yoke, clacking gently as furrows open. And you wonder if somewhere under your boots a coin still sleeps, guarding a harvest that never came. If you dig it up, you're not stealing, you're auditing. You crest a low hill and see the patchwork of the estate unfolding, strips of abandoned grain, pockets gone to scrub, and in the middle, a rough-shorn square where sheep clearly graze when someone remembers to gate them in. It's the visual version of a sentence that loses its grammar halfway through. Historians still argue whether this rewilding happened in a sudden rush right after the plague years or unfolded gradually across the 14th and 15th centuries as demographics and prices shifted. You take in the view and think, probably both, panic now, policy later, like most human things. Down in the hollow you catch sight of a hedge bank pricked with hazel and sloe. Berries darken in clusters, and a few late blossoms cling on, confused but determined. You run your fingers along the bank's top and find an old boundary stone, lichen thick, its carved mark softened to a rumour. Once, that mark decided who owed whom a chicken at Michaelmas. Now it's a mossy paperweight for the field mice. You chuckle and tell the stone it's been downsized. Paperwork is lighter when half your clerks have disappeared. Joke 2. The HR department will send a parchment. You stop to rest beside a gate whose latch has been replaced with a loop of frayed rope. The rope is slick from weather and use. Someone is still coming. Through here, just not often. You imagine the new rhythms, a surviving widow driving sheep, a teenager in oversized boots checking snares, a monk's lay brother collecting herbs in the ditch. The old bell that rang the start of ploughing is silent, but a different economy ticks forward, softer, improvisational. Where once the year marched in order, plough, sow, weed, reap, it now drifts like the pond's edge, adapting to whoever still draws breath. You walk on, and the ground turns springy under your feet, the first hints of young woodland. Birch shoots flicker pale, and oak saplings push through last year's leaf litter like small fists. Birds chatter as if they've held a secret meeting and voted to recolonize. People used to complain that wolves haunted the outskirts of places like this. With fewer hunters and more cover, animals test the boundaries again. Whether their numbers truly surged after the plague, or whether frightened survivors just noticed them more, remains another point of debate. Either way, you tighten your cloak and listen for twigs snapping. Nothing, just the forest practicing breathing. The sky dims toward late afternoon, that pearly grey that smooths every edge. You pick your way across a half-collapsed stile and into what used to be a flax plot. The blue flowers would have been a summer haze here, destined for thread and cloth. Now it's a tangle of mugwort and yarrow and grasses so tall they stroke your elbows. You think about hands that once pulled flax, soaked it, broke it, heckled it, daily crafts that doubled as the village heartbeat. Gone but not erased. The tools linger in barns, the memory sits in fingertips that survived. Maybe next spring someone tries again, or maybe the sheep get it all, you don't know, and that unknowing is a new normal. You pass a pair of ruts cut deep in clay, evidence of the old carts that once rolled harvest home. Rain has filled them into twin mirrors reflecting clouds. You step over and nearly slip, catching yourself on a tuft of grass. You glance around, pretend no one saw, and tell the field, "I meant to do that." Joke 3. The weeds applaud politely. You think about how even clumsiness changes when you're alone. Embarrassment requires an audience. As evening leans in, you circle back toward a ridge where the wind brushes the grass in long, sleepy waves. The land isn't angry, it isn't kind, it's just ready to be told what to do again, or not. The truth is that wildness here is less a rebellion and more a waiting room. With so many hands gone, the earth keeps growing in whatever direction is easiest. And if that direction is pasture for wool or birch and oak for future firewood, then the countryside will wear those choices with the same quiet face. You pause and look back toward the barn where you ate chalky grain and found beetle dust. The day has stretched into a soft ache in your legs, your breath warm in the cooling air. Tomorrow could bring a Lord Steward counting acres, or a shepherd boy counting sheep, or simply more thistle-counting bees. For now, the fields breathe, and you breathe with them, a small, steady metronome in the long music of recovery. You tug your cloak close and step on, weeds parting like a curtain, the countryside taking one slow bow before night. You crest a hill and descend into the lowlands where the manor house should gleam with activity. Once these walls rang with clattering pots, barking dogs, and servants bustling like ants under the gaze of their lord. Tonight, though, the courtyard is hushed. A few hens peck nervously at the dirt, feathers ragged, as if even poultry sensed the shift in power. The noble family here did not survive intact, and that means opportunity. You pause by the gates, watching new faces occupy the hall, lesser gentry, cousins twice removed, men with more ambition than bloodline. The plague thinned the nobility just as surely as it did peasants. A mainstream fact, across Europe, noble houses collapsed when heirs died young, often without children. Lands splintered, titles jumped sideways, and entire regions saw new men rise, minor knights, ambitious stewards, or opportunistic in-laws suddenly wearing velvet. You're seeing it unfold here. Banners faded, but the courtyard bustling again under new management. Inside, you spy one of these freshly minted lords pacing the hall. He doesn't wear the practiced arrogance of an old aristocrat. Instead, his robe hangs awkwardly, as if borrowed from someone taller. He squints at parchment, muttering about rents, wages, and repairs. The irony is thick. Yesterday's steward is today's baron, expected to rule a territory he once just tallied accounts for. You half expect him to whisper, "Wait, do I actually own this castle now?" That's joke one. New nobility is basically the medieval lottery, minus the giant check presentation. The village folk, or what's left of them, shuffle in nervously. They eye this new lord like he's a substitute teacher, unsure if they can get away with mischief or if discipline will be harsher than before. Some kneel out of habit, others stand straighter than they used to. After all, fewer peasants means bargaining power. A quirky tidbit here: there are records of surviving peasants simply walking away from their old masters, strolling over to the next estate and selling their labour for better wages. Imagine medieval job hopping complete with the awkward "I'm leaving for a competitor" chat. Except the competitor is a castle down the road. The new lord knows this too. He tries to look stern, but his eyes flick nervously as he addresses the crowd. All labourers must return to their fields tomorrow. His words echo in the hall, but the murmurs that follow are anything but obedient. You can feel the shift. The peasants aren't just surviving now, they're realizing they're valuable. And that realization is more dangerous to the old system than any plague rat. Historians still argue whether this redistribution of power was immediate or gradual. Some claim the Black Death was the nail in feudalism's coffin, that labour shortages gave peasants instant leverage. Others argue lords fought back fiercely with laws like the Statute of Labourers, trying to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. The truth likely sits in between, a tug-of-war between desperate nobles and emboldened peasants, each side trying to write the new rules of survival. As the meeting disperses, you notice the small shifts of culture trickling down from this upheaval. Servants who once bowed at every word now linger a little longer before obeying. Children chase each other in the courtyard without fear of scolding, their laughter echoing where once only rigid formality lived. Change doesn't march in with a fanfare. It tiptoes in on nervous smiles and hesitant acts of defiance. Walking the corridors, you see the tapestries fading, moth-eaten in spots. The grandeur is thinner than it looks. Wealth doesn't replenish itself, and these new lords inherit both assets and burdens. You pass by the storeroom and glimpse shelves half-stocked, barrels of ale lighter than before, smoked meats reduced to scraps. Even noble tables feel the pinch. Yet the dining hall still hosts feasts, more for show than sustenance. One roasted goose paraded in front of guests is stretched to feed far too many. You smirk to yourself. Medieval fine dining is basically smoke and mirrors, with extra smoke from the hearth. Joke 2. Come for the banquet, stay for the crumbs. Later that night you sit by the outer wall, the manor glowing faintly in the torchlight. You reflect on how power doesn't vanish with plague, it mutates. Those who survived step into roles they never imagined. Some thrive, some flounder, and beneath their velvet robes, fear still lingers. You can almost hear it in the way their voices waver when they talk of the future, as if they're not entirely sure they belong in this new world either. Out on the road, a band of wandering peasants pass by, laughing loudly, packs slung over their shoulders. They don't bow to the manor gates, don't even glance inside. They're already on their way to some place with better wages, better treatment, maybe even land of their own. And you realize the plague didn't just kill people, it cracked the old hierarchy, letting bold ones slip through the fissures. You lean back, staring up at the stars glittering beyond the battlements. For centuries, peasants had been trapped in rigid order, tethered like oxen to land and lord. Now, in the quiet wake of so much death, the ropes are fraying, and though the new lord struck nervous, sly in stolen robes, the true shift is happening out on the roads, in the fields, and in the tired but stubborn footsteps of the common people. And joke 3 for the night. You think about writing "fake it till you make it" on a banner for these fresh lords, but medieval calligraphy ink is in short supply. You leave the manor's flickering torchlight behind and step back into the cool night. The road bends toward low fields, where you notice small fires dotting the horizon, peasants gathering, voices carrying faintly through the dark. Curiosity tugs you closer. As you approach, you realize they aren't whispering prayers or lamenting losses, they're talking business. Around the embers, men and women in rough tunics trade stories of wages. The steward down by the next village pays double, one says, gnawing on a crust of bread. Another nods, adding, "And he throws in ale on feast days." They laugh, not cruelly, but with the sly confidence of people who know, maybe for the first time in their lives, that their labour actually matters. Here's your mainstream fact anchor. After the Black Death, labour shortages gave peasants unprecedented bargaining power. Fields still needed ploughing, but with half the workforce gone, surviving workers could demand higher wages and better conditions. Documents from the late 14th century record wages rising steeply across Europe, despite laws like England's Statute of Labourers 1351, which tried to freeze pay at pre-plague levels. The statute might as well have been parchment wallpaper. Peasants knew their worth, and enforcement was nearly impossible. You squat by the fire and listen. One young man boasts he told his old landlord to plough it himself when ordered back to the manor, a bold move in any century. He grins as he recounts how he walked down the road and was instantly hired elsewhere for triple the grain ration. That's the medieval version of rage quitting your job and landing a better one the same afternoon. Joke 1. You almost expect him to say, "And my new boss actually lets me work from home." The group isn't just men. A young widow leans in, sharing how she now rents a plot directly from the manor because no one else aimed it. She grins shyly, admitting she earns enough from her surplus cabbages to trade for meat. In a world turned upside down, she's climbed a step that once would have been barred. This too was a ripple of the plague, women taking on roles in agriculture and business that had been tightly guarded by men before. You bite into an apple from last night's foraging and notice how easy it is to picture a future where peasants don't simply grovel, they negotiate. A quirky tidbit for you. In some regions, peasants even walked into town squares wearing garlands of flowers as symbols of their bargaining power, a cheeky "look how much you need us" fashion statement. Imagine strolling into a job interview today in a flower crown just to underline your importance. Historians still argue whether this newfound leverage truly ended serfdom. Some say it began the slow crumble of the feudal order, while others argue lords adapted quickly, locking peasants back into bonds of duty with stricter laws. The debate is unresolved, but what's undeniable is that the relationship shifted. The firelight in these peasants' eyes is more than hunger, it's recognition of worth. You stand and wander a little farther into the fields, imagining tomorrow's dawn. Instead of obedient hands quietly harvesting, you picture peasants haggling with overseers. "No, not for a penny a day, 2 and bread." The overseer sighs, realizing he has no choice. This negotiation, repeated across countless villages, is a revolution not shouted in the streets, but whispered at barns and wells. On the way back, you pass an abandoned plough left rusting in the grass. You lay a hand on its cold metal. Once peasants had no say. This plough would be theirs to pull until their backs broke. Now they choose whether to touch it at all. For a fleeting moment, you feel the ghost of their newfound freedom, as if the soil itself is where it can't demand loyalty anymore. You chuckle to yourself, imagining a medieval help wanted sign nailed to a tree, farm hands needed, competitive wages, free turnips, must provide own scythe. Joke 2, the HR department would have a field day, literally. By the time you reach the roadside, the stars are scattered thick overhead. You hear faint singing from the peasant campfire, a tune more cheerful than mournful. Maybe it's the ale talking, but maybe it's hope. Even after famine and plague, laughter sneaks back in, carried on voices that realize tomorrow could finally be theirs to shape. As you lie on a patch of grass, cloak wrapped tight against the chill, you reflect on what you've witnessed. The nobility scramble in their drafty halls, clutching parchment and pretending nothing has changed. But out here, by firelight, among workers who once bent spines in silence, change is already alive. And that, more than any law or statute, will define the future. Your eyelids droop, and with a last glance at the sparks rising into the night, you whisper, "The peasants are awake now, and no amount of parchment can put them back to sleep." And joke 3, you wonder if centuries from now historians will argue whether these peasants invented the first medieval version of LinkedIn, Peasant Inn. Endorsements in sheep herding and ploughing, but only for double wages. The road winds you back toward a small market town, though calling it a market now feels generous. Where once stalls jostled shoulder to shoulder, hawkers shouting prices over each other. Today the square is nearly bare. A few scattered vendors spread their goods on rickety tables, stale bread, a sack of onions, a bundle of dried herbs. And yet, despite the thin offerings, something surprising catches your eye. Bright splashes of colour. You squint, realizing the drab greys and browns of peasant tunics are punctured here and there by vivid greens, scarlets, and even streaks of golden yellow. It's like the survivors collectively decided, if death's going to stalk us, we might as well look fabulous. A lanky man struts past wearing a hat so tall it could double as a chimney, its brim flopping comically with each step. You nearly laugh aloud. It's as if fashion suddenly declared, the plague may have killed your neighbours, but at least your hat can touch the heavens. Here's the mainstream fact to ground this strut down the cobbles. The mid-14th century did indeed see shifts in clothing styles. Survivors embraced brighter dyes and more daring cuts, rejecting the sombre tones of their parents. Tight hose, short tunics, and extravagant hats became symbols of vitality, defiance, dressed as wardrobe. Some historians even argue that the explosion of flamboyant clothing after the plague was a way to mock death itself. As you wander the stalls, you spot a quirky little item, a pouch stitched with peacock feathers. The vendor explains it's a plague charm guaranteed to ward off illness. You raise an eyebrow. According to legend, peacock flesh never decayed, so feathers were thought to carry protective powers. In reality, you know it's just a feathered wallet. Still, you imagine someone stuffing it with coins, muttering, "See, totally plague-proof." Joke 1. You half expect the Yinduski vendor to upsell you with a limited-time warranty. You pass a tailor's stall where he's proudly displaying a tunic dyed in costly crimson. He explains business has never been better, because rich and poor alike are splurging on clothes as if to say, if I die tomorrow, I'll at least look expensive. You watch as a woman haggles fiercely over a pair of green stockings, eventually triumphing with a victorious grin. For a moment you forget the empty houses, the hollow fields, the market buzzes, not with numbers but with colour. Historians still argue whether this surge in fashion was truly widespread or more confined to urban elites. Some point to records of peasants adopting brighter hues. Others suggest it was mostly merchants and nobles who indulged. Standing here in this half-empty square, you realize the truth is messy. People at every level seem to crave brightness, whether it's a dyed tunic or just a ribbon pinned to a plain shirt. You lean against a fountain and imagine how jarring this would look to someone transported from before the plague. Back then, sumptuary laws tried to dictate who could wear what, limiting silks and rich colours to nobility. Now, with so many dead and social order wobbling, people wear whatever they can grab. You smile to yourself. The afterlife must be confused seeing a ploughman in purple hose swagger past St. Peter's gates. The square grows livelier as afternoon light filters down. A group of musicians, 2 fiddlers and a boy banging a drum, strike up a tune. Their clothes are patched but daringly patterned, stripes and checks clashing in ways that scream, "We don't care about your rules." Children skip in circles, some wearing makeshift crowns of flowers, others waving scraps of dyed cloth like flags. For once, joy feels louder than grief. You buy a small strip of cloth yourself, dyed in uneven but cheerful blue. Wrapping it around your wrist, you feel a little less like a wanderer in a graveyard and more like a participant in this bizarre rebirth. The cloth smells faintly of indigo and wood smoke. You chuckle. Fashion in this world isn't about survival, it's about stubbornness. Humans will eat mouldy bread if they must, but heaven forbid they do it in boring beige. And joke too, you can't help but picture a medieval runway, models trudging in wooden clogs, striking poses, audience clapping politely before someone yells, "Work it, Jeffrey!" As the sun dips lower, shadows lengthen across the square. You notice the tailor carefully folding his crimson tunic, the feather charm seller packing up unsold goods. Life doesn't roar back in overnight, but even these small splashes of vanity are proof of resilience. People dress louder when they're afraid, like whistling in the dark, except in silk stockings. Historians still puzzle over whether this fashion shift signaled the birth of something bigger, the early Renaissance appetite for individuality and art. You sip from a mug of weak ale, watching the crowd thin, and think maybe it did. Or maybe it was simply people saying, "We're alive, so let's not look like corpses." Either way, the splash of colour brightens a world still haunted by shadows. Before you leave, you catch sight of the tall hat man again. He bows dramatically to no one in particular, hat brim nearly brushing the dirt, and struts off into the twilight. You grin. Death may still stalk the land, but at least ridiculous hats are immortal. And joke 3. You muse that if hats keep getting taller, by next year they'll double as scaffolding for new houses. 2 problems solved at once. The last strains of music from the market fade behind you as you wander into the town's churchyard. The bell tower leans slightly, its stones weathered, its bell rope frayed, as though even the building is tired of calling people to prayer. You duck inside, and the air shifts immediately, cooler, quieter, laced with candle smoke and something faintly metallic. A handful of villagers kneel on the hard stone floor, their murmured words echoing off the vaulted ceiling. You pause in the shadows, listening. The prayers don't sound like confidence, they sound like questions. Here's the mainstream fact to anchor this moment. The Black Death severely shook confidence in the church. For centuries, the clergy had preached that prayer, fasting and devotion would shield communities from calamity. But when plague swept in and priests died alongside their flocks, many people began to doubt. How could divine protection fail so completely? The once unshakable authority of the church cracked in places, and through those cracks, doubt seeped. You step farther inside, noticing details. Wax drips unevenly down a candelabrum, pooling in hardened puddles. A tapestry of the Virgin Mary hangs lopsided, colours dulled. A priest mutters at the altar, his voice hoarse. He looks older than his years, his robes patched in several places. You realise why. So many clergy had perished that replacements were hastily recruited, often poorly trained, sometimes barely literate. Some communities even accepted men who'd once been barred from holy service. Desperation makes exceptions. You slide into a pew trying to blend in and overhear 2 women whispering. One admits she isn't sure prayers work anymore. The other hushes her quickly, eyes darting to the priest. Their faces carry both reverence and suspicion, a tension that seems to live in every candlelit corner. Historians still argue whether this loss, As you step outside again, the churchyard greets you with a scatter of graves. Some are marked, others are fresh mounds with no names, only wooden crosses. A man kneels by one, clutching a rosary, his lips moving feverishly. You hear him mutter promises. If his family is spared, he'll donate his ox, he'll walk barefoot to Canterbury, he'll do anything. You know the desperate bargaining tone. Humans haven't changed much. Joke 2, you half expect him to throw in, and I'll stop complaining about Mondays. The setting sun casts the church in red gold light, and you notice how its tower looks less like a beacon of faith and more like a survivor itself, scarred, leaning, still standing but weary. That, perhaps, is the truest image of belief after plague. Not vanished, not triumphant, but worn thin, holding on because letting go feels worse. Historians still debate whether this disillusionment was the seed that grew into the Reformation centuries later. Some argue, yes, the cracks in trust widened until they split the church. Others argue, no, it was more a passing bruise than a fatal wound. But as you walk past the graves and the fading prayers, you sense how once sturdy certainties became softer, shakier, and shakiness has a way of growing with time. You pause at the church gate, glancing back one last time. Candles flicker faintly in the windows, but the sound inside is less worship than it is weary pleading. You whisper to yourself, even God must be exhausted after this. Then you turn toward the road, where twilight thickens, carrying you into a world where faith no longer feels quite as solid underfoot. And joke 3. You grin at the thought that if saints had Yelp reviews, Sebastian would have 5 stars during plague years. Efficient arrow blocking. Would pray again. You leave the churchyard behind, stepping onto the quiet road as the last bells fade into the night. The cool air carries scents of damp stone, smoke, and something faintly sweet, maybe herbs drying on a neighbour's wall. Faith may be wavering, but fear is alive and pacing every alley like a stray dog. You tug your cloak tighter as you pass cottages where charms dangle from doorways. Sprigs of sage, knotted cords, and little leather pouches stuffed with who knows what. Each one is a whispered promise of safety. Here's the mainstream fact to anchor you. In the aftermath of the Black Death, superstitions swelled. With priests unable to provide answers, people turned to amulets, charms, and ritual chants. From Italy to England, survivors carried odd talismans, believing they could block plague or evil spirits. Rational medicine was thin, so belief rushed in to fill the vacuum. You pass a woman leaning over her threshold, muttering a rhyme as she sprinkles salt across her doorway. She doesn't look embarrassed. Everyone knows salt keeps demons out, or so they say. You half expect her to add, also keeps the snails away, because frankly, it works for both. Joke 1. Medieval multitasking at its finest. One pinch wards off hell, another flavours your stew. In the market lanes, you notice children wearing small bells sewn to their tunics. Each jingle is a nervous talisman, the idea being that noise scares sickness away. It sounds cheerful on the surface, but the undertone is eerie, like a parade of tiny alarm clocks. You crouch to watch one boy tug his sleeve proudly, announcing, "The plague won't dare come near me." His mother smiles faintly, though her eyes betray a tired hope rather than conviction. A quirky tidbit drifts into your thoughts. In some German towns, people carved strange little faces, gargoyle-like masks to hang on doors. Supposedly, evil spirits would mistake them for actual residents and move on, confused. Picture a demon strolling by saying, "Oh, looks like they're already home, I'll try next door." It's the supernatural version of a cardboard cutout in a shop window. Historians still argue whether these practices were desperate improvisations or continuations of older pagan traditions simply repackaged. Were these charms born new in crisis, or were they relics of older folk beliefs suddenly brought back into fashion? No clear answer, but as you walk under a sky freckled with stars, you feel the weight of both possibilities. Humans cling to whatever tools feel closest, whether they're rosaries or rowan branches. You duck into a narrow alley and nearly trip over a string of garlic bulbs stretched across a doorway like bunting. Someone clearly believes garlic wards off death, not just vampires. You chuckle, muttering to yourself that at least the house will smell like an Italian kitchen. Joke 2. Somewhere a medieval chef is yelling, "Finally, we're safe and seasoned." The deeper you wander, the stranger it becomes. You stumble across a circle of stones carefully arranged in the street. In the center sits a clay jar filled with ash, feathers, and coins. It's not for decoration, it's a ward meant to confuse wandering spirits or disease. You don't step inside, not out of belief, but because superstition is contagious in its own way. You know logic should win, but a small part of you thinks, what if it works? By a tavern, a group of men sit with mugs of ale, boasting about their talismans. One swears his iron key worn on a string keeps him safe. Another insists his pouch of dried frog hearts has done the trick. They laugh nervously, each trying to outdo the other's charm. You can't help but grin. It's like a medieval version of comparing antivirus software. Joke 3. You imagine them saying, "Mine blocks all plagues. Premium subscription." The tavern keeper, wiping mugs with a rag that has seen better centuries, leans over and mutters, "Doesn't matter what you wear. If it wants you, it finds you." His eyes dart left and right, as if afraid the plague might be eavesdropping. His words slice through the night, leaving the men silent for a beat before they drown it with another round of ale. You continue walking, noting how the streets themselves feel transformed. Every charm, every rhyme, every oddity is a physical marker of invisible fear. Where faith once dictated order, superstition now stitches together daily life. It doesn't banish the dread, but it gives it shape, something you can hang above your door, sew into your tunic, or bury at the crossroads. As you step out of town, the path grows quieter. Crickets sing and the moon hovers, fat and pale. You finger the strip of blue cloth still tied to your wrist, and for the first time you wonder, is it just decoration, or is it your own unconscious charm? Maybe both. In a world where even priests are unsure, who wouldn't hedge their bets? You breathe in the night air, a mix of damp earth and faint wood smoke, and whisper, "If fear wants a talisman, let me be my own." Then you tug your cloak tight and follow the road, the faint jingle of a child's bell echoing behind you like a lullaby against the dark. The night stretches on as you follow the road into a hamlet where a single cottage still glows with firelight. Curious, you peer through the open shutter and catch sight of something at once familiar and strange. A woman crouched over a wooden stool, grinding herbs with a pestle. The air drifts out, heavy with rosemary, sage, and something sharper you can't quite place. She mutters to herself as she mixes, pausing to toss in a pinch of powder from a jar marked with a crudely painted skull. This is medicine after the Black Death, equal parts hope, ritual, and creative guesswork. A mainstream fact grounds the scene. Medieval medical practice still leaned heavily on the humoral theory, the idea that health depended on balancing the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Remedies aimed to restore balance, whether by purging, bleeding, or prescribing herbs thought to cool or warm the system. After the plague, that theory didn't vanish, but desperation opened the door wider to experiments and folk cures. The woman ladles her mixture into a clay cup, handing it to a pale young man lying on a pallet. He sips reluctantly, grimacing at the taste. You can't blame him. The brew smells like boiled cabbage left out in the sun. She pats his shoulder and murmurs that it will draw the sickness out. He nods weakly, though the doubt in his eyes says it all. A quirky tidbit pops into your mind. In some regions, people drank potions made of ground-up emeralds, believing the precious stone had healing powers. Others applied poultices of pigeon parts directly onto buboes. Yes, pigeon parts. Apparently, nothing says "get well soon" like a warm bird compress. You stifle a chuckle at the image, wondering if the pigeons ever held a union meeting about workplace safety. Joke 1, you can picture them picketing, "We coo, we don't cure." You move on toward the village square. Past the cottages, the road widens near a field where villagers have set up a bonfire. Around it, they burn herbs, believing smoke purifies the air. Children toss sprigs into the flames, giggling, while elders chant prayers. The crackling fire illuminates faces lined with both fear and stubborn hope. It's part ritual, part medicine, part communal therapy. Nobody knows if it works, but everyone breathes a little easier watching sparks fly upward, carrying their worries with them. You pause at the edge, the fire warming your face. You think about how fragile and resourceful humans are in equal measure. Medicine here isn't about guaranteed cures, it's about clinging to whatever thread of possibility feels strongest. Sometimes it's herbs, sometimes it's pigeon poultices, sometimes it's a bonfire under the stars. As you continue down the road, you can't shake the feeling that these remedies, however odd, carry more than just ingredients. They carry the weight of hope, and hope itself can be medicinal, even if it smells faintly of garlic and singed feathers. Morning finds you on a rutted road that remembers wheels, hooves, and the long sigh of caravans. The air shifts before the scenery does, a ribbon of fragrance that sneaks ahead of its owners. Pepper that pricks your nose, cinnamon rolling warm like a low drum, and saffron's shy, honeyed whisper threading the breeze. You follow your nose into a town that looks half-mended, new beams slotted into old frames, fresh tiles flashing on roofs. But the market square pulses with a cautious heartbeat. Fewer stalls, yes, and wider gaps between them, as if the benches themselves are practicing social distancing. But there, under a patched awning, you see it. Cones of spices, each a tiny mountain range of colour. You drift closer, the ground crunching with stray seeds. The pepper looks like black hail piled in tidy slopes. Next to it, nutmeg as smooth as river stones. Cinnamon sticks resemble bundled roof laths, only they promise pastry instead of shelter. The merchant, hard eyes, friendly voice, waves a fan slowly over the goods to keep flies away and theatrically wafts the scent toward you. Trade routes again, he says, though the roads still cough. His phrase hangs in the air like incense and truth. A mainstream fact steadies your senses. Within a few years of the worst plague waves, overland and maritime trade corridors in Europe creaked back into motion. Venice, Genoa, and other ports resumed voyages, while inland fairs like those in Champagne and Frankfurt reawakened, albeit hesitantly. Demand for spices, cloth, and metal goods remained, and surviving merchants filled the gaps left by the dead, sometimes amassing fortunes simply by showing up with stock. You taste that history at the tip of your tongue as you accept a single peppercorn to bite. It detonates like a tiny firework. You cough once, tear up, and the merchant grins. Proof of quality, he says. Joke 1. Free samples. Dong Medieval Edition, 1 peppercorn, infinite consequences. Not everything looks so breezy. At the square's edge, a clerk in a short robe sits beneath a crude sign, Bills of Health. Ship captains and mule train leaders approach, producing parchment stamped and counter-stamped to declare their last ports clean. The clerk squints, then thrusts the papers through a slit board as if even ink might be contagious. He sniffs, dramatic, unnecessary, and seals them again. You hear whispers about ships held in roadsteads for weeks and caravans lingering at town gates until officials finish their tally of goods and their tally of courage. The word quarantine doesn't sit on everyone's lips yet, but the practice is already muscling in, the habit of holding men and merchandise apart until time does what medicine cannot. Beside the clerk, a brazier crackles. A boy drops sprigs of juniper onto the coals. The smoke drifts around bales and crates, blessing them with the perfume of cleanliness, symbolic mostly, but symbols are currency here. A woman brings a basket of letters tied with twine. The scribe spears each with an iron spike, lifts them through the smoke, then sets them aside to cool. Quirky tidbit: in some places, officials fumigate mail and even pierce letters to let the corrupted air escape, sealing them afterward with fresh wax. Your own fingers itch to rescue the words trapped in those envelopes, but you let them be, tiny prisoners of a policy that is part hygiene, part theatre. You can't blame the actors. Fear still buys tickets. Historians still argue whether municipal health boards and these early quarantines sprang chiefly from port cities' mercantile self-interest, protect the market at all costs, or from a genuine shift toward public welfare as a civic duty. Looking around, you suspect both. Profit wants the roads open, fear wants them closed, and policy tries to split the difference with smoke, stamps, and waiting. The spice merchant flicks your attention back to his table. "Taste this," he says, cracking a nutmeg with a little iron blade. He shaves a curl into your palm. You sniff, and suddenly the barn grain of yesterday feels far away. This is the smell of kitchens that tell better stories. He points to a pyramid of ginger, dusty, and nobbled. "Good for the stomach," he claims, and then, lowering his voice, "and for foul airs." You smile at the confidence. Remedy or recipe? Yes. In a world like this, most ingredients moonlight. You remember your own blue cloth bracelet and think how easily a ribbon becomes a charm, a spice, a shield, a smell, a comfort. A girl at the neighbouring stall sells oranges studded with cloves, pomanders tied with scrap ribbon. Children bat them between hands like little fragrant comets. You buy one, lift it to your face, and the clove's sharpness clears a path through your head. "Keep it near your mouth," the girl says, serious as a surgeon. "It sifts the air." You nod solemnly because solemnity seems part of the purchase. Later you hang the pomander from your belt and admit it's also a conveniently portable snack if things go sideways. Joke 2, dual-use technology, filter today, garnish tomorrow. At the far end of the square, a wool trader counts coins with a concentration that would shame monks. He wears a tall hat, cousin to the chimney you admired earlier, and a leather purse heavy enough to be its own chaperone. Wool boomed in some regions after fields turned to pasture, and cloth halls in towns like this are learning to hum again. You watch bales being weighed, bolts of rough cloth unrolled, edges checked. Pepper perfumes the left side of the square, lanolin wraps the right. Together the smells make a marketplace of contradictions, stubble and silk, barn and banquet, sweat and saffron. Two muleteers argue over a sack that rips under its own ambit. Tion, cumin, pouring out like sand. You step back instinctively as if cumin might bite. The merchant shrieks at the loss, then immediately drops to his knees, scooping fistfuls back into the bag, eyes wet. You kneel to help, and he blesses you in 3 languages, one of which might be invented on the spot. When the crisis calms, he offers you a pinch as thanks. You pocket it, smiling, and think about the barn's beetle dust jar. Some powders promise safety, others just flavour. All of them are anchors when the world tilts. Under a linen canopy, a city official reads out a new ordinance. Incoming caravans must pass the night in a field beyond the north gate. No one may enter until sunrise bells. Groans roll across the square. Business hates sunsets imposed by decree. Still you see nods. Caution is the tax the times demand. The official clears his throat and adds a sweetener. Reduced stall fees for the next fair to encourage attendance. You almost clap. This is what recovery looks like. Rules wrapped in incentives, worry braided with enterprise. Joke 3, limited time offer, buy 1 quarantine, get half off your market stall. You notice too the way people handle coins, a quick dip in a bowl of vinegar, a wipe on cloth, a look that says we both know this is symbolic, but let's pretend together. It's theatre that steadies hands. A few merchants have even rigged long wooden tongs to pass small parcels without touching fingers. You try not to grin at the absurdity, but also at the ingenuity. The same species that fashioned beetle dust and pigeon poultices now invents contactless delivery using salad tools. A caravan master bids for lodging at the inn, but the keeper points to a notice on the door. Upper rooms only for travellers with clean bills, common room for locals. The system is porous, imperfect, and human. The master shrugs, unrolls his blanket beside his mules, and is snoring in 5 minutes. You envy his uncomplicated philosophy. The road is long, the straw is dry enough, tomorrow will happen. By late afternoon, the square settles into a rhythm. A baker carries out trays of honey cakes dusted with, you sniff, probably the very cinnamon from 2 stalls over. Children dart past with sticky fingers. A clerk argues politely about customs duties with a merchant who argues impolitely about everything. The bell in the church, still leaning a little, taps time, and no one flinches at its sound. You look around and realize that fear hasn't left. It's simply learned to share the bench with appetite. You buy a paper twist of mixed spice, pepper, ginger, a little clove, and tie it into your pouch beside the blue ribbon and the pomander. Your pockets are becoming a museum of coping mechanisms, faith, superstition, flavor, and policy, all carried on the same hips. As the sun slides, the square glows like a low ember. Faces turn toward opportunity the way flowers turn toward light. Trade does not roar back like a storm. It returns like a tide, then pauses, then advances again, leaving bright shells, peppercorns, coins, promises, glittering in the wet sand of the day. You turn from the market with one last lungful of cinnamon air and step back onto the road. The mule bells behind you keep time like a sleepy metronome. Ahead, another town waits, perhaps with more smoke on its letters, more vinegar in its bowls, more laughter squeezed between worry and work. You tug the pomander so it taps your chest, thump, thump, and walk on, the reopened roots tickling your senses and your caution in equal measure. The road spills you into the outskirts of a city just as the afternoon light begins to slant golden across rooftops. From a distance, the skyline looks patchy, like a smile with too many missing teeth, gaps where houses once stood, and new brick chimneys poking up like proud replacements. As you step through the crumbling gate, you notice that life here doesn't whisper anymore, it hums. Not the full-throttle roar of a metropolis before the plague, but a cautious, stuttering buzz, like a fiddle player warming up between songs. Streets that once echoed only with silence now thrum with hammers. Carpenters lean out of half-built frames, shouting for nails. Apprentices scurry with buckets of plaster, splashing more on themselves than the walls. You pass a mason crouched over a fresh pile of bricks, stacking them neatly while his son stirs lime in a trough. The smell of mortar stings your nose, sharp and chalky, but it's oddly comforting. It smells like recovery. Here's the mainstream fact to anchor you. In the decades after the Black Death, many European cities experienced a wave of rebuilding. Timber-framed houses went up quickly to replace ruined ones, but increasingly wealthier citizens chose sturdier stone and brick, ushering in subtle architectural shifts. Narrow alleys filled with new shops, guild halls sprouted, and even town walls were patched and reinforced. The plague had leveled communities, but the survivors rebuilt with stubborn hands. You wander into a side street where laundry flaps overhead, strung between houses that look barely finished. A woman leans out of a window to shake a rug, dust tumbling onto your cloak. She laughs an apology, then calls to a neighbor across the way. They chat about the cost of roof tiles, voices bouncing between the new walls like playful echoes. Normality is creeping back, brick by brick, gossip by gossip. A quirky tidbit khaki. Ease your eye at the next corner. A mural hastily painted on a plaster wall. It shows dancing skeletons holding hands with living townsfolk, their grins exaggerated, their feet mid-step. It's the famous danse macabre motif, a reminder that death spares no one, lord, priest or peasant. But here, someone has added a twist, a skeleton wearing a mason's cap, lugging a brick. You chuckle softly. It's morbid humor, but also resilience. If death's going to dance, it might as well help with the construction. Joke 1. You imagine the townsfolk saying, "Finally, a labourer who never asks for higher wages." In the market square, stalls spill with goods again, though not as many as before. A cooper haggles over barrel prices. A cobbler waves a shoe triumphantly, declaring it good as Venetian. Children chase each other between carts, one tripping and skinning his knee. He wails until his mother scoops him up, kissing his forehead. The sound is ordinary, achingly ordinary, and you realize how precious such small cries must feel after years of funerals. Historians still argue whether this urban revival was uniform across Europe or uneven, with some cities thriving while others shrank. Evidence suggests both. Venice and Florence bounced back into commercial power, while smaller towns faded permanently. Standing here, you can almost sense that divide, some districts crackling with rebirth, others still hollowed shells where weeds push through cobblestones. You stop by a tavern rebuilt with fresh beams, its sign swinging in the breeze. Inside, the air is warm with ale and conversation. Patrons sit shoulder to shoulder again, though you notice a nervous habit. Each mug rim is wiped carefully before being passed. A fiddler plays in the corner, his tune cheerful enough to earn claps on the table. You sip from a shared jug, grimacing at the sourness but savouring the camaraderie. For the first time in days, you hear laughter louder than whispers. Outside, the narrow alleys glow in the last of the sun. You pass a carpenter locking his shop, his hands raw, but his grin wide. He tells a passerby he hasn't had this much work in years. So many homes to rebuild, so many guild orders to fill. You nod silently, realizing how death's wreckage has, paradoxically, fueled a boom for those with skills and tools. And joke too. You wonder if medieval carpenters ever complained like modern contractors. Sorry, backlog's huge. Can fit you in, maybe 1372. As twilight deepens, the city doesn't quiet, it softens. Torches light the streets, their glow reflecting off new plaster and scaffolding. The air fills with smells, roasting meat from a vendor, wet earth from fresh foundations, and faint incense wafting from a chapel under repair. A group of boys runs past, carrying sticks, pretending to be knights. Their laughter trails behind them like a ribbon, and for a moment you almost forget the graves outside the walls. At the far edge of town, you stumble across a row of houses left unrepaired. Doors hang open, ivy crawling over lintels. A cat darts out, glaring at you as if to claim ownership. The contrast is stark, one street rebuilding, another surrendered. You pause, caught between the two, feeling the precarious balance of recovery. The city is reborn, yes, but only where survivors are bold enough to claim space again. You lean against a hair source. You wake to the sound of chisels tapping stone and brushes swishing over plaster walls. Following the noise, you drift toward a chapel on the edge of the city where scaffolding clings like a wooden skeleton. The workers don't look grim. They hum, laugh, even whistle off-key. And as you step inside, your eyes widen. The interior glows with fresh paint, brighter than you expected after so much darkness. Across the walls, frescoes burst with colour, angels swirling in vivid blues, saints outlined in fiery reds, and even everyday villagers painted into biblical scenes. A shepherd kneels by the manger with his dog faithfully at his side, and artists wink to the locals. You breathe in the damp mineral scent of lime plaster mingled with pigments. The air smells like rebirth. Here's the mainstream fact to set the scene. After the Black Death, Europe experienced a surge in artistic expression. In part it was devotional, thank offerings to God for survival. In part it was defiance, images of life painted brighter, bolder, as if to shove back against death. Some historians argue that this flourishing of art set the stage for the Renaissance. You tilt your head toward one wall where a painter balances on scaffolding. He dips his brush into a pot of ultramarine, the pigment so rich it feels like staring into midnight itself. You know ultramarine comes from lapis lazuli, imported at enormous expense from Afghanistan. The parish couldn't have afforded such luxury before, but now, with land and wealth redistributed, new patrons fund new visions. Art becomes both prayer and prestige. A quirky tidbit drifts to mind. In certain villages, survivors hired artists not just to paint saints, but to paint portraits of the dead into murals, little ghostly cameos peeking from windows or kneeling at altars. It was memory stitched into plaster, ensuring loved ones stayed present in sacred spaces. Outside, the artistic pulse doesn't stop at church doors. You walk into the town square and find minstrels playing lively tunes, their instruments patched, but their energy unbroken. A puppet show has gathered children who squeal with delight as wooden figures clatter through a story of a bumbling knight. Even the puppets seem brighter, their painted faces exaggerated, their antics loud. The message is clear. Life insists on laughter, even if it has to come from a marionette's wooden jaw. You buy a scrap of parchment from a scribe selling quick sketches. He scratches out a drawing of you in a few strokes, handing over a lopsided but oddly charming portrait. "To prove you were here," he says. You grin, tucking it into your pouch. Proof of existence. That's art's truest role now. And joke too. You realize this sketch is basically the medieval version of a bad mall caricature. All it's missing is a caption. You survived the plague, and all you got was this drawing. As twilight settles, lanterns glow along the narrow streets, their light spilling over painted shutters and carved lintels. Some doors display simple floral patterns, others bear painted talismans, half art, half superstition. The city has become a canvas, every wall, every beam carrying brushstrokes of defiance. You pause near a tavern where a new mural stretches across its facade, villagers dancing hand in hand, skirts swirling, hair unbound. In the background, skeletons dance too, not menacing, but grinning in rhythm. It's both warning and celebration, life and death locked in a reel. You smirk, muttering, "Well, at least the skeletons have rhythm." Joke 3. Somewhere a lute player is sighing. "Even the dead keep better time than I do." You lean against the wall, letting the painted dancers blur in the torchlight. The city around you hums not with mourning, but with creativity spilling out of woo. Endies. Art isn't just decoration here, it's a rebellion, a hymn, a lullaby against silence. And as night deepens, you realize that even after plague, brushstrokes and melodies are stubbornly immortal. You drift from the painted tavern into a quieter quarter of the city where the clamour of hammers and fiddles gives way to the rustle of parchment and the scratch of quills. Ahead stands a schoolhouse, its wooden beams freshly repaired, candlelight glowing from narrow windows. You slip inside and find benches packed with youths leaning over books, their voices low but lively. The air smells of wax and ink, with just a hint of chalk dust floating like mist. For the first time in your wanderings, you hear not lamentation or gossip, but debate. Here's your anchor. After the plague, universities and schools across Europe saw new energy. Yes, death had cut down scholars and masters, emptying classrooms, but recovery brought a surge of curiosity. Surviving institutions like Oxford, Paris, and Bologna became hotbeds of questioning thought, and new schools sprouted in towns that once barely taught the alphabet. Knowledge didn't collapse, it reshaped itself, often more daring than before. At the front of the room, a grey-bearded teacher reads aloud in Latin, quoting Aristotle on natural philosophy. A boy in the back raises his hand, bold enough to interrupt. But master, if the humours failed to explain the plague, why trust them still? The room stirs with murmurs, and the teacher lowers his book. He doesn't scold, he sighs, then he admits, perhaps we must think further. You can feel the ripple, heresy to some ears, liberation to others. Historians still argue whether this post-plague intellectual ferment was a direct cause of the Renaissance or simply coincidental timing. But sitting on the bench among these restless students, you sense how trauma loosens the tongue. When a third of the world dies, even sacred knowledge begins to look negotiable. You notice a quirky scene at the back, a pair of students secretly passing around a notebook filled with doodles. In between, Latin glosses, they've drawn caricatures of their professor. Nose exaggerated, wig too large, arms flailing like a scarecrow. The sketches make their classmates stifle laughter. Even here, with mortality fresh in memory, students carve space for mischief. Apparently, the medieval equivalent of doodling in the margins is timeless. Joke 1, you whisper, "Congrats lads, you just invented the very first meme." After class ends, the benches empty into the courtyard. A group clusters around a manuscript illuminated with golden vines and small animals frolicking in the margins. They argue about astronomy, one swearing the stars influence plagues, another insisting it's foul air, while a third mutters about divine punishment. Their debate is heated, but it doesn't fracture. It feeds itself, each voice daring the others to prove more. You realize knowledge itself is beginning to wobble on new legs, less about repeating tradition, more about testing ideas. You follow one student into the library, really just a few shelves of chained books. He runs his finger reverently down a spine, then opens a volume of Galen's medical writings. "Still," he says, "we learn much." Then, almost guiltily, he adds, "but not enough." He closes the book, the chain rattling faintly, and you can't help but hear the symbolism. Wisdom bound, waiting for someone to break the lock. And joke 2, you picture a future librarian slapping a late fee on a chained book. "Sorry, it's been overdue since 1352. You sit at a desk with a group of scholars poring over parchment maps of the heavens. One points out Mars's position during the plague years, claiming its red glow poisoned the air. Another rolls his eyes and says the real culprit was corrupted vapors. A third argues it must have been divine anger. None agree, yet none fall silent. The conversation loops, expands, circles back, each argument stretching the possibilities a little wider. Historians might disagree about the plague's intellectual legacy, but in this candlelit room you can almost feel the first cracks in medieval certainty. Outside, students gather under the stars themselves. One boy, cloak thrown dramatically over his shoulders, recites a line of Virgil, then pivots to suggest maybe the ancients didn't know everything after all. Gasps and laughter ripple through the crowd, some scandalized, some delighted. You think this is how revolutions start, not with shouting crowds, but with questions whispered under the night sky. You wander on, reflecting how strange it feels. The same generation that buried half its kin now fills benches with restless energy, daring to ask if the old answers still hold. They're not dismissing tradition entirely, but they're reshaping it, bending it toward a world that needs new tools, new frameworks, new explanations. As you step back into the lamplit, night falls thicker than usual, the kind of dark that seems to drink the torchlight as you move. At first you think the wind is singing, low, rhythmic, mournful, but then you round a bend and see them. A line of figures in white tunics, hoods shadowing their faces, bare feet slapping softly against the cobbles. They carry lanterns and banners, and between each slow step comes a chorus of voices chanting in a steady tide. You stop, half hidden behind a doorway, and watch the procession advance like a moving wound dressed in linen. They aren't merchants or monks, they're penitents, wandering zealots who believe the world will only right itself if human skin offers payment. Two men in the center unroll a banner painted with the Man of Sorrows. Others lift wooden crosses, and then the rhythm changes. Tunics come off, backs are bared, and the first lashes fall. Leather thongs studded with little iron points whistle through the air and crack. You wince despite yourself. The chant deepens. The line moves, stops, strikes, prays, moves again. It's a ritual with its own stubborn gravity. A mainstream fact steadies your breath. Movements like this, later remembered as the flagellants, surged during the worst plague years, especially around 1348 to 49. They travelled from town to town performing public penance, convinced that collective sin had invited catastrophe. Many wore white garments marked with red crosses, followed strict schedules, and drew crowds equal parts terrified and fascinated. For a while they were tolerated, then authorities from city councils to Pope Clement VI condemned them as disruptive and theologically off course. Bans followed. The processions kept coming anyway, like tides ignoring maps. You edge closer, staying in the lamplight's fringe. The smell here is a mix of sweat, tallow, and the metallic tang that lingers after iron bites skin. One man reads aloud. Historians still argue whether these brotherhoods offered true comfort to ordinary people or whether they inflamed panic and scapegoating. Some sources credit them with drawing communities together in shared ritual. Others blame them for stoking violence, including attacks on marginalized groups falsely accused of causing the plague. You feel the ambiguity in your bones. Ritual can gather people into one beating heart or into one clenched fist. A bell clangs twice, robes slide off shoulders, the scourges rise again. You notice that some men wear little wooden boards hung around their necks, painted with symbols. A skull, a drop, a vine, codes to mark vows, ranks or chapters, miniature heraldry of hardship. One older penitent hesitates, closes his eyes, then swings with a whisper of air. The iron tips leave constellations across his back. He exhales like a man tossing stones into a river, each strike a skipped pebble. You're not sure whether you're watching torment or relief, maybe both. A boy at your elbow tries to mimic the chant, voice cracking, then giggles and covers his mouth. His mother clamps a hand on his shoulder and murmurs a warning about laughter at sacred things. You want to tell her that nervous giggles are the brain's own safety valve, but you settle for a small smile the boy can't see. Joke 2. If medieval towns had a no laughing sign, it would hang right next to no cart parking on market days. The procession winds toward the square. At its edge, city officials hover like crows deciding whether to land. One clerk clutches a rolled ordnance. Another has the look of a man calculating fines. The leaders of the Brotherhood bow stiffly, deference as strategy. You sense negotiation happening in glances. Officials want order, the zealots want a stage, the crowd wants a reason their fear makes sense. Tonight, a shaky truce holds. Tomorrow, who knows which way the ink will dry. You drift along the flank of the crowd and discover the makeshift camp where the Brotherhood has stowed their belongings. Bundles of coarse cloth, a few loaves, a dented kettle, and a stack of scourges lying quiet as sleeping snakes. On a cloth laid like a small altar sit sprigs of rosemary and lavender, the same herbs you've seen burned to clean the air, here repurposed as offerings. A girl no older than 12 carefully ties fresh knots into a leather thong, lips moving in a private prayer. You want to hand her a harmonica and teach her a gentler ritual, but this century doesn't speak harmonica. Near the campfire, two townspeople debate. One insists the Brotherhood's suffering turns God's face back toward the city. The other shakes his head and says sickness cares only for fleas and breath. Their argument is friendly, resignation threaded through the words like twine. You could tell them about bacilli and vectors, but you're a traveller in a story, and stories honour their own clocks. In this clock, what can be done is what you can carry, sing and strike. A man in the robes notices you watching and, mistaking your curiosity for yearning, offers a novice's cord. Walk, he says, and be lightened. You weigh the cord in your hand. It's rough, oiled, surprisingly heavy. You picture yourself in the line, the chant in your throat, the sting on your shoulders, the momentary stillness after each blow when the world narrows to a single, clean ache. You hand the cord back gently and answer with the smallest bow you can manage. His eyes show both disappointment and mercy. Then walk with us in silence, he says, and that you can do. So you walk, not as a penitent, but as a shadow, feet keeping time with their rhythm. Lantern light swims over the stones, the banners ripple, the chant folds around you like thick cloth. You think of other processions, the market's cautious reopening, the students' flood of questions, the masons' ladders ascending. Humans form lines for many reasons: to buy, to learn, to build, to plead. Tonight's line is made of pain braided to hope, a rope thrown at the sky. At the square's center, the leader lifts his arms and the chant dissolves into whispers. He speaks of mercy, of turning the world back upright, of making each stripe a bridge across a void. You're not converted, but you are moved, because movement is what you've been watching for days, the slow pivot from collapse to continuation. The Brotherhood begins to disperse, leaving behind damp stones and the lingering echo of sung syllables. A dog who has never read an ordinance trots out to sniff the air and decides everything is the same as it was. Night, people, smells, the promise of crumbs. You exhale, shoulders loosening. Whatever you think of their doctrine, you can see the work it does. It gives shape to fear, a choreography for sorrow, a script for a world that won't explain itself. Maybe tomorrow the council will post a ban, maybe the next town will cheer them in. For now, the street grows quiet, and you step carefully around a forgotten scourge as if it could still bite. And joke 3, part of you wants to organize a penance by nap guild. Lie down, breathe slowly, atone horizontally. Membership would skyrocket by bedtime. You turn down a lane washed in moonlight. Somewhere behind you, the last hymn thins into a thread and snaps. Ahead, a shutter clicks, a baby fusses and is soothed, a kettle clinks softly on stone. Life, unpersuaded by spectacle, keeps doing its small, necessary miracles. You follow the sound of the kettle because warmth feels like the only doctrine that never needs an ordinance. Dawn takes its time, as if it too is waiting for official permission. You wake to the clack of a wooden hammer on a board. Thwack, thwack, the town crier's voice riding the cool air. By order of the council. Oh good, nothing says new day like fresh rules. You shuffle toward the square and find a crowd already knotting together. Traders with vinegar-dipped coins, apprentices with plaster in their hair, a widow you recognize from the fields. The crier unrolls a parchment long enough to double as a table runner and begins to read. Wages first. Surprise, they're to be fixed at customary rates. You feel the mood tilt. The blacksmith beside you mutters that customary died with half his cousins. A mainstream fact steadies the scene. Rulers across Europe tried to pin labour to pre-plague prices. England's Ordinance of Labourers, 1349, and the Statute of Labourers, 1351, famously capped wages and punished workers who refused service. Other realms issued similar edicts, hoping parchment could plug a demographic hole. You watch faces harden as the crier drones on about fines, stocks, and idlers to be set to work. The statute may as well sigh, please pretend nothing changed. The crowd's silence says everything did. Next comes movement. Strangers must present bills of health at the gate. Caravans will sleep outside the walls, and any traveller without proper seals is to be gently detained. You smirk. Only the law could sandwich gently beside detained and keep a straight face. You catch a wink from yesterday's spice merchant. His goods will still arrive, but they'll nap in a meadow first. The clerk from the square looks triumphant, brandishing his ink as if it's bug spray. Then clothing, of course. The crier lists who may wear silk, who must stick to wool, and how many inches a hat may reach above respectable heads. You glance around for your favourite walking chimney. He's slouched in defeat. Sumptuary laws bloom whenever bright colours do, a way to wrestle status back onto a price tag. If your hose look too joyous, the council would like a word. You tug your blue ribbon a little lower on your wrist as if hiding a misdemeanour. Now a municipal gem. Refuse to be kept in barrels at street ends. Pigs to be ringed or confined. Night soil carts to pass only at dawn. The crowd murmurs approval, not because they love rules, but because they love breathing. A quirky tidbit slips in on cue. Some towns even required swine to wear tiny wooden muzzles so they couldn't root in trash. You picture a pig in a polite mask, grunting, "Good day, madam, I am here for civic hygiene." Joke 1. Somewhere a pig guild is drafting a strongly worded oink. The crier isn't done. He waves another sheet. Burials outside the walls only. Grave depths. Standardized. No more ringing the death bell after twilight because allegedly the sound corrupts the air and panics the living. You can almost hear a cluster of bell ringers muttering, "We don't corrupt, we clang." Still, less tolling might mean more sleeping, and your channel is technically bedtime history, so you offer the ordinance a sleepy thumbs up. Then come the parts with teeth. Vagrancy, redefined to include anyone refusing lawful service, heavier penalties for masters enticing servants, and new fees for changing employers without license. You've seen this tug-of-war building since the campfire wages talk. Parchment pulling one way, bodies tugging the other. Historians still argue whether such statutes genuinely slowed wage growth or mostly pushed negotiations into shadows. Were they effective tools or comfort blankets for anxious elites? You look at the blacksmith again. His shoulders say he'll take the better offer at the next village and risk the fine. Paper is tough. Hunger and leverage are tougher. A reeve reads a royal letter sprinkled with Latin flourishes like parsley. The crown demands order, taxes, and obedience for the common good. You can feel the monarchy flex, kings tightening grips while treasuries ache, poll taxes, hearth taxes, levies on ale and cloth, coins to pay for distant wars and nearer repairs. Your mind jumps ahead because you've been walking through time with open eyes. When anger and debt ferment together, they brew revolts. The crier doesn't know it, but somewhere a future called 1381 sharpens a pitchfork. You drift to the edge of the crowd as a notary sets up shop under an awning, quill nib shining like a tiny spear. He's drawing up fast-track deeds because death has turned inheritance into a relay race. Widows petition, orphans' guardians bargain, cousins argue over fields that went wild while everyone was busy surviving. Law steps in not as a philosopher, but as a broom. You watch a woman sign with a careful X and straighten a fraction taller. Paper as exoskeleton. Inside the guild hall, another set of rules hammers into place. Masters limit how many apprentices they'll take. Too many mouths, too few steady orders. Regulate shop hours so no one steals the sun. And dies prices lest competition turn cutthroat. A cooper argues that his barrels deserve a premium. A baker counters that his loaves are larger in spirit. The alderman splits the difference because that's what aldermen do. You slip into a bench and listen as the guild also outlines sick lists and burial funds. Mutual aid codified, grief turned into tables and dues. City health officers, new title, same anxiety, parade their toolkit, vinegar bowls for coins, smoke lanes for letters, fines for households that won't sweep their gutters. One holds up a wooden ladle with a handle absurdly long, contactless compliance, 14th century style. You try not to laugh and fail. Joke 2, some inventor just filed the first patent for the do not touchy spoon. On a side street, you find a notice nailed to a door. By council order, gatherings for scourging are forbidden. The flagellants from last night have met their match in prose. A monk passing by shrugs and whispers that some bands will stick and others will melt. Human fervour is excellent at loopholes. You think of the girl tying knots in a scourge thong and wonder whether law can untie what fear has bound. You head toward the gate to watch how the new travel rules breathe. A wagon arrives. The guard compares seals, frowns at a smudge, and sends the driver to the waiting field beyond the ditch. No shouting, no drama, just the quiet click of policy taking a bite. A boy trots by with a basket of oranges and cloves, the pomanders you bought yesterday, and a small sign that reads, "Approved for sweetening the air." Entrepreneurship, you note, reads the ordinances too. At the riverside, a clerk tallies fines collected in kind. 2 bolts of rough cloth, a basket of onions, and astonishingly a wriggling sack of eels. You grin. Medieval law has a talent for turning everything into currency. Eels do not swipe, but they do slither into ledgers all the same. The clerk, ink-stained and unbothered, writes paid. 1 sack of eels with the seriousness of a treaty. Joke 3, imagine the audit. We're missing 3 eels and a hat. Explanations? Toward evening, you settle on a low wall and watch the city test its new skeleton. Streets seem straighter simply because someone said they should be. A constable asks a peddler to lower his hat height to the legal brim, and somehow the man complies without losing dignity. A widow sweeps her threshold and pauses, reading the burial ordinance posted opposite. She nods as if clarity itself is a mercy. A baker counts coins into vinegar, wipes them on his apron and whistles. Ritual reinforcing rule, rule reinforcing ritual. You think of all the laws you've inhaled today and taste their flavours: panic, prudence, theatre, and desire. Some statutes will outlast this season: sanitation, burial grounds, the idea that councils owe health to citizens. Others will buckle: wage caps snapped by reality, hat height decrees laughed into silk ribbons. Historians still argue whether the post-plague decades mark the birth of a stronger state or just a frenzy of bandages. From your bench, the answer feels like a braid. Fear making rules, need bending them, time choosing which strands to keep. Night sidles in. Lanterns bloom along the lanes, each a tiny sun with municipal permission. You tug your blue bracelet, breathe through your clove-studded orange, and listen to the papers rustle in doorways. Law is trying to teach the city how to sleep again. Curfews, closures, quiet bells. People murmur, bargain, comply. Rebel, repeat. And somewhere beyond the walls, fields whisper that they don't care about ordinances, only rain. You slide down from the wall and start walking, steps soft on the newly swept stones. Behind you, the crier hangs his hammer, rules posted, voice spent. Ahead, the road bends toward smaller comforts: bread, ale, a bed that doesn't argue. You smile to yourself. In a world relearning its boundaries, the gentlest laws are the ones your body writes. Lie down, breathe, keep going. The road leads you into a quieter lane where the weight of statutes and penalties fades, replaced by something softer, the pulse of daily comforts sneaking back into rhythm. You catch the smell before you see the source, fresh bread, crust crisping in a stone oven. The aroma clings to the evening air like a warm blanket. You drift toward a cottage where a baker slides loaves onto wooden boards, their steam fogging the window. He notices your hungry glance and grins, breaking off a hunk to offer. You bite, and the chew is hearty, the crust crackling against your teeth. For a moment, you almost forget about rules, plagues, and lords. Here's the mainstream fact grounding your taste buds. After the plague, bread remained the cornerstone of medieval diets, though grain types shifted. With fewer people to feed, wheat became more common even for peasants, replacing the coarser rye and barley loaves that once dominated. In fact, some regions recorded better diets overall for survivors, with more meat, dairy, and white bread suddenly within reach. Hunger still lurked in places, but for many, the table grew richer than before. Children tumble past the bakery clutching apples, their laughter scattering like birds. A fiddler perched on a doorstep plays a lively tune, earning coins tossed into his cap. You lean against a wall, letting the music mingle with the bread's warmth. These are not grand spectacles or decrees, they're the stitches of ordinary life tugged back into place. A quirky tidbit slips into your mind. In some towns, new festivals sprang up after the plague, mixing relief with superstition. Villagers danced in circles around bonfires or staged mock trials of death itself, sentencing it to banishment. You imagine the scene, a guy in a skeletal mask sulking as children pelt him with bread rolls. Joke one, you mutter, medieval community theatre, where even death it's bad reviews. You wander into the town square where ale barrels are being tapped. The froth spills golden and bitter into wooden mugs passed from hand to hand. Ale houses thrive again, buzzing with chatter and song. You sip from one mug, grimacing at the sourness but savouring the camaraderie. A farmer across the bench slaps your shoulder, boasting about the bumper crop of beans he gathered this season. He admits it's easier when half the neighbours' fields are yours for the taking. Morbid arithmetic, but it puts meat in the stew. Historians still argue whether these new comforts were widespread or patchy. Some claim survivors enjoyed unprecedented prosperity, while others note that famines and hardship returned quickly in certain regions. Both views are true. Comfort after catastrophe was uneven, fragile, and often temporary. But in the laughter bubbling around you, you hear how people cling to what they can, even if tomorrow's stew is thinner. The ale flows freely, loosening tongues. Stories rise about saints spotted in dreams, about ghosts wandering in fields, about the neighbour who swears his cow talks now. Everyone chuckles, everyone nods, everyone drinks. It's the timeless formula. Food plus drink equals community, even when the world has been shredded. As night thickens, the festival mood builds. A bonfire blazes in the square, sparks climbing into the sky. Men toss logs on while children dance around the flames. A woman starts singing a ballad, her voice rich, drawing others to join. You find yourself swaying with the rhythm, bread and ale sitting warmly in your belly. This is resilience distilled, not speeches or statutes, but song. You catch a whiff of roasted meat and follow it to a spit where a haunch of pork turns slowly. The cook bastes it with herbs, the scent making your stomach rumble. You buy a slice, juice dripping down your fingers, and lick it clean. For a fleeting second you forget entirely the shadow of the plague. Comfort isn't just survival, it's joy, even messy, greasy-fingered joy. And joke too, you laugh to yourself thinking if happiness could be bottled it would taste like pork grease and spilled ale. By the fire's glow you see children play a game with sticks and hoops, shrieking when sparks crackle too close. Their parents watch with weary smiles, maybe thinking about how few children remain. but also grateful for the ones who laugh. Festivals double as memorials here, grief woven quietly under the music but not smothering it. You sit with your back against a wall, mug in hand, flame light dancing in your eyes. Bread, ale, laughter, music, none of it grand, all of it essential. Comfort may not erase trauma, but it patches the edges enough to let you drift towards sleep with a full belly. And joke 3, you imagine some official trying to regulate happiness. By order of the council, no more than 2 laughs per household per evening. The crowd would laugh 3 times just to break the rule. As you close your eyes, the fiddle still plays, the fire still crackles, and you realize this is how humanity survives, not by outrunning death, but by throwing festivals in its face. The bonfire smoke still lingers faintly in your cloak as dawn pushes grey light across the square. The laughter of last night has quieted. Now you hear older voices, slow and deliberate, weaving stories to younger ears. You wander toward a bench where 3 elders sit, mugs of weak ale in hand, faces mapped with wrinkles. Children cluster at their knees, half curious, half bored, but all listening. One woman begins her tale with the simplest of words, "When the sickness came." The children lean closer, wide-eyed. She describes neighbors collapsing in the fields, entire cottages falling silent. Her voice quavers when she mentions burying her sister, but she doesn't flinch. This is history not written in books, but carried in lungs and memories. Here's your grounding fact. Generational trauma left a deep mark on medieval Europe. Survivors told and retold plague stories, embedding them in family lore, sermons, and even lullabies. Songs that once soothed children now included warnings about sickness, famine, and the fragility of life. These memories shaped not only individuals but cultures, passed like heirlooms. A boy pipes up. Why did God let it happen? The old man beside the woman sighs, stroking his beard. Historians still argue, you think wryly, though here the answer is simpler. We don't know. Some say it was punishment, some say it was the air, some say it was just our time. The children nod solemnly, too young to grasp nuance, but old enough to feel the weight of uncertainty. Nearby, another elder hums a lullaby that sounds sweet at first, soft notes drifting like smoke. But the words carry shadows, lines warning little ones to beware the breath of night and the stranger's touch. Quirky tidbit. Such plague-shaped songs became common, embedding fear as protective advice. Imagine being rocked to sleep with a gentle tune that doubles as a PSA. You whisper. As evening comes, you sit by another hearth where survivors share their experiences in more casual tones. They joke about absurd remedies tried, neighbors who swore by garlic necklaces, or the priest who insisted chickens tied to your feet could draw out plague. Laughter bubbles up, but behind it lies something raw, mockery as a bandage over memory. One old man leans toward you and says softly, "You never forget the smell." He doesn't explain, he doesn't need to. You feel the silence settle heavy, and then he sips his ale and changes the subject to fishing. That's how memory works. It leaks in, then ducks away before it drowns you. Later, you watch as a grandmother hums another lullaby, this one gentler. Its words speak of spring returning, fields greening, and the promise of tomorrow. The child drifts to sleep against her shoulder, and you realize trauma doesn't just scar, it also insists on hope. Generations carry both, tangled together like threads in a tapestry. And joke 3, you think to yourself, future historians might argue whether kids fell asleep faster to plague lullabies or to lectures about Aristotle. Honestly, both sound equally soporific. As night folds over the town, you step outside, your breath clouding in the cool air. You realize you've spent the day not walking through ruins or rituals, but through memory itself, etched into lullabies, jokes, sighs, and silences. Generational scars don't fade. They become the bedtime stories, the whispered warnings, the nervous laughter. And in that way, the Black Death lingers, not in bodies anymore, but in voices. You wake the next morning to a city stirring more boldly than before. The hammering of builders, the chatter of merchants, the laughter of children. It's not just recovery anymore. There's a different hum in the air, one that feels curious, restless, forward-looking. You wander into a small courtyard where a group of young artisans stand huddled around a sketchbook. At first glance it looks like scribbles, but then you notice perspective lines, arches, and tiny figures drawn to scale. Someone here is dreaming bigger than repairing roofs. Here's the mainstream fact anchoring this scene. Out of the ashes of the Black Death, Europe slowly shifted toward the ideas we call the Renaissance. With so much land, wealth, and opportunity redistributed, survivors funded art, learning, and invention in ways that had seemed impossible before. Fewer mouths to feed meant more surplus resources, and that meant some could afford to think beyond mere survival. One young man flips the page to show a design for a dome, scribbled calculations scrawled along the edge. His friends argue over whether the angles could actually hold. They sound like engineers in training, though they wouldn't call themselves that yet. Historians still argue whether the Renaissance was truly born from the plague or whether it was just accelerated by it. But standing here, listening to these ambitious voices, you can feel how absence has created space. Space for questions, for art, for daring ideas. A quirky tidbit catches your eye on a nearby table. A scrap of parchment with a sketch of a flying machine. Not the kind you'll ever see lift off in this century, but clearly the ancestor of later dreams. The drawing shows wings strapped to a man's arms, notes about air currents scrawled beside it. You smirk, whispering, "Good luck with that belly flop, friend." Joke 1, early aviation, where the first step is enthusiasm, and the second step is gravity. You wander into the workshop of a painter mixing pigments. He stirs crushed minerals with egg yolk, the colours gleaming like jewels in little shells. But his sketches aren't just saints anymore. One shows a merchant counting coins, another a woman cradling a child. Ordinary people, elevated into art. That shift feels small but revolutionary, life itself becoming worthy of reverence. Out in the square, students gather around a travelling scholar who gestures wildly with a rolled manuscript. He talks of ancient texts rediscovered, Aristotle and Galen debated, Cicero and Virgil reread with fresh eyes. Why should we only copy, he demands. Why not question? Why not add? His words spark murmurs. Some nod in excitement, others in nervous caution. You can almost see sparks leap between them. And joke 2, you think, if TED Talks existed, this guy would already have 1 million views. How to survive a plague and rethink Aristotle in 10 easy steps. The conversation drifts toward philosophy, natural science, even questions about whether man might measure the world with numbers instead of just prayers. It's not consensus. It's friction. But friction makes fire, and fire lights new paths. As you stroll further, you see signs of this seed sprouting everywhere. A mason shows off a new arch technique, boasting it will outlast timber. A musician experiments with harmonies that sound richer, layering voices in ways that echo like cathedral bells. A scribe carefully copies not just scripture, but poetry, letting margins blossom with doodles of vines and human faces. You realize people aren't just rebuilding what was lost, they're building something else entirely. Historians still debate how conscious this shift was. Did survivors know they were laying foundations for a rebirth? Or were they just following curiosity where it led? Probably the latter. No one wakes up saying, "Welcome to the Renaissance." They simply wake up hungry for more than bread and ale, ready to stretch their imaginations the way they once stretched dough. You pause by a boy chalking circles on the pavement. He crouches, tongue sticking out in concentration as he measures crude angles with a bit of string. His sister watches, teasing him that it looks silly. He grins and says, "One day, I'll measure the stars." The line makes you pause. Out of famine, silence, and scars, that kind of dreaming still dares to grow. And joke 3, you mutter, "Give him a few centuries and he'll invent geometry homework, ruining math class for everyone." By dusk, you sit on a low wall, watching lanterns glow across the city. The colors feel brighter now, not just painted on walls, but woven into the air itself. Ideas float like seeds on the wind, fragile but determined, ready to take root in soil fertilized by loss. The Black Death left scars, yes, but also space. And in that space, humanity whispers, maybe tomorrow can be more than survival. Maybe tomorrow can be something new. Night folds over the city like a heavy velvet curtain, muffling the last hammer blows and silencing the street cries. You walk toward the outskirts, leaving behind the lantern-lit alleys and the chatter of taverns. Beyond the walls, the countryside opens wide beneath a blanket of stars. They burn cold and steady, indifferent to human catastrophe. The same lights that watched when the plague struck, and the same that will shine long after your story ends. You find a grassy knoll, ease yourself down, and let your body sink into the cool earth. The silence here is different from the silence of abandoned villages. That silence felt sharp, accusatory, like a wound that wouldn't close. This silence feels gentler, like a deep breath finally exhaled. The grasses sway in the night breeze, brushing against your cloak with a sound like whispers. You stare at the constellations, remembering how people once blamed them for the plague. Mars in fiery aspect, Saturn sulking in its house. Historians still argue whether such astrology truly guided policy or merely offered comfort, but lying here, you see why people reached upward. The sky looks so permanent when everything below shifts and shatters. You think back on what you've seen: empty cottages, wild fields, new lords fumbling in velvet robes, peasants negotiating wages by firelight, hats tall enough to double as scaffolding, saints sharing space with garlic charms, and children dancing around bonfires with bread in their fists. You realize history after plague wasn't one story, but thousands stitched together, some with gold thread, some with ragged string. A quirky tidbit flickers in your memory. In some regions, people ended the day by placing bowls of water outside, believing spirits of the dead needed a drink as they wandered. You glance around, half expecting to see such a bowl glinting in moonlight. None appears, but you imagine. And ghostly footsteps padding softly through the grass, grateful for the thought if not the vessel. You chuckle to yourself, whispering, "Sorry folks, I drank the ale instead." Joke 1, poor ghosts denied their medieval hydration station. Your breath fogs faintly, the night air cool against your skin. In the distance, a wolf howls, answered by another farther off. Once such sounds would have filled survivors with dread, wolves reclaiming abandoned land. Now it feels less like menace and more like reminder. The world doesn't end with us, it simply keeps moving. You stretch out on the grass, arms behind your head, and think of tomorrow. There will be more rebuilding, more bargaining, more laughter stitched over scars. Humanity will limp forward, uneven but determined. You smile, realizing you're part of that long walk too, even if only as a dreamer passing through. And joke too, you muse that if death itself kept score, it must be irritated by now. I threw my worst at them, and they're back to arguing about hat height. The stars shimmer, your eyelids grow heavier, and the world softens around the edges. You think of the painter's angels, the student's questions, the peasant's songs. Each was a kind of defiance, a candle lit against the vast dark, and though plague left Europe with scars deeper than any statute could measure, those scars became soil where new roots dug in. You breathe slower, each inhale long, each exhale longer. The grass cradles you, the night folds tighter, and your thoughts blur into one final truth. People endure, sometimes clumsily, sometimes foolishly, sometimes beautifully, but always. And joke 3, you grin faintly at the idea of history itself, sighing, "Fine, take your naps, but at least write it down for the kids." The stars blur, your body loosens. The story doesn't end, it simply drifts. The night has grown deeper now, softer, as if even time itself has slowed its pace to match your breathing. The grass around you sighs with every passing breeze, and the stars above blur gently, as though they're leaning closer just to keep you company. You no longer hear the distant hammer of builders or the chatter of markets. Instead, the world has quieted into something tender and hushed. With each breath, the day's heaviness slips further from your shoulders. The emptiness of villages, the sting of loss, the strange remedies and stranger hopes, they feel less like sharp memories now, and more like echoes fading into a calm rhythm. Your mind drifts toward the simpler sensations, the cool earth beneath you, the faint hum of insects in the dark, the soft tug of fabric against your skin. These are the anchors that hold you steady, no matter what centuries pass above. You let your thoughts slow, stretching them out like threads, each one thinner, lighter, until they barely weigh anything at all. Imagine the stars as lanterns, not distant fires, but close companions, swaying gently to lull you. Imagine the night air as a blanket, wrapping you in warmth you didn't notice before. Imagine that tomorrow will come, steady and unhurried, carrying bread, laughter, and maybe even a new tune hummed in the square. Let the images fade now, the scaffolding, the wild fields, the painted walls. They dissolve into a soft blur, replaced by stillness. You are safe, you are quiet, and in this quiet, sleep waits patiently. So let yourself drift, breathe slowly, rest deeply, and let the night carry you where it always intended, to dreams, to peace, to tomorrow's gentle light.